Hey, what if the person everyone ignored turned out to be the hero nobody expected? Picture this: a woman standing quietly in a crowd, dismissed, mocked, but hiding a secret that could change everything. What are you doing here? Women don't know a thing about fighter jets. The jeers rang out as Sarah Mitchell stood quietly in the crowd, just another nameless civilian. They had no idea that 12 years ago she had been a Top Gun legend, burying her past in silence. But when the emergency sirens wailed and an F-22 spiraled out of control, its young pilot sending out an SOS, everyone heard the name thought lost forever. Mitchell. Valkyrie, back in the cockpit. Hold on, can you imagine being counted out, only to prove them all wrong in a moment that stops the world? Subscribe to Once Upon a Voice for stories that hit hard and lift you up. Sarah stood there, her hands tucked into the pockets of her plain gray hoodie, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. The coastal sun beat down on the air show, the crowd buzzing with excitement, kids pointing at the jets roaring overhead. She didn't look like much to them. Just a woman in faded jeans and scuffed sneakers, no makeup, no flash. Her face was calm, but her eyes were locked on the sky, tracing the F-22's sharp angles as it carved through the clouds. She'd been coming to these air shows for years, always standing at the back, never saying a word. Nobody knew her. Nobody cared to. But today something felt different. Her fingers tightened around an old keychain in her pocket, a tiny metal jet she'd carried since her Navy days. It was the only piece of her past she let herself hold on to. A vendor nearby, a middle-aged man with a sunburned neck and a loud voice, was selling airshow t-shirts. His booth swarmed with buyers. He caught sight of Sarah standing alone and rolled his eyes. "Hey, lady, you lost? This ain't a yoga retreat," he called out, waving a shirt like a flag. The crowd around him chuckled, heads turning to stare. Sarah's fingers paused on the keychain, her eyes flicking to him for a moment. She didn't answer, just shifted her weight and looked back at the sky. The vendor snorted, muttering to a customer, "Some people just don't belong." His words hung in the air, sharp and careless, but Sarah's face stayed steady, her gaze unwavering. The air show was packed. Families sprawled on blankets, vendors hawking hot dogs and cheap plastic flags. Sarah had slipped through the crowd, finding a spot near the edge of the field, close enough to see the runway, but far enough to avoid attention. She liked it that way, out of the spotlight, just another face. She'd been living in this small coastal town for a decade, teaching yoga at a community center, her life quiet and steady. Nobody asked about her past. Nobody needed to. But the jets overhead? They pulled at something deep inside her, something she'd buried long ago. She shifted her weight, her sneakers crunching on the gravel, and let her gaze drift to the horizon. A young girl, maybe 10, stood nearby with her dad, clutching a model jet. She pointed at Sarah, her voice curious but loud. "Daddy, why is she here all alone? She doesn't even look like she likes planes." Her father, a burly guy in a polo shirt, glanced at Sarah and shrugged. "Probably just lost, kiddo. She doesn't know what's going on." The girl nodded, satisfied, and ran off to get ice cream. Sarah's hand tightened in her pocket, the keychain's edges biting into her skin. She took a slow breath, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she stayed quiet, her focus locked on the F-22 looping high above. Then it happened. A sharp crack split the air like a whip snapping. The crowd gasped as the F-22 wobbled, its sleek frame tilting unnaturally. Black smoke trailed from one engine. The radio tower crackled, the young pilot's voice cutting through. "Mayday. Mayday! I've lost control!" Panic rippled through the crowd. A mother grabbed her kid's hand, pulling him close. A guy in a baseball cap shouted, "It's gonna crash!" Sarah's head snapped up, her body going still. Her hand gripped that keychain so tight it dug into her palm. The jet spiraled lower and lower, a dark streak against the blue sky. If this story's hitting you, grab your phone real quick, hit that like button, and drop a comment below. Let Once Upon a Voice know what's resonating with you. Want more stories that dig deep and don't let go? Subscribe to Once Upon a Voice. It means the world to keep this going. All right, back to Sarah. The crowd was chaos now, people shoving, some running for cover. A group of young guys in flashy sunglasses stood nearby, their laughter cutting through the noise. One of them, tall with a cocky grin, pointed at Sarah. Yo, what's she staring at? Think she's gonna fix that jet with her yoga moves? His buddies snickered, tossing empty soda cans into a pile. Another one, shorter with a gold chain glinting, leaned in. Bet she doesn't even know what an F-22 is. Look at her, probably here for the food trucks. The words stung, but Sarah didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed on the jet, her jaw tight. She took a slow breath, her fingers brushing the keychain again, and stepped forward, closer to the barrier. A woman in a volunteer vest, clipboard in hand and a tight smile, approached Sarah, her tone syrupy but sharp. Excuse me, ma'am, this area is for VIPs and staff only. You're not on the list, are you? She tilted her head, her eyes scanning Sarah's plain clothes with obvious disdain. The people nearby turned, smirking, waiting for Sarah to back down. Sarah looked at her, her expression calm but unyielding. I'm where I need to be, she said, her voice low, and turned back to the sky. The volunteer's smile faltered, her pen hovering over the clipboard, but she stepped back, muttering under her breath about civilians. An older man, a retired pilot with a weathered face and a navy cap, stood a few feet away. He'd been watching her, his eyes narrowing like he was trying to place her. He leaned toward his friend, voice low but loud enough for her to hear. Heard she tried Top Gun. Once, couldn't hack it, dropped out early. Shame, really. His friend nodded, sipping a beer. Figures. She doesn't look like she belongs here. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge them, but her shoulders squared just a fraction, and she took another step toward the runway. A woman in a bright sundress, her nails painted coral, pushed through the crowd with a fake smile. She was the kind of person who thrived on status, always checking who was watching. She stopped near Sarah, looking her up and down, her nose wrinkling. Honey, this isn't your scene, she said, her voice dripping with pity. You look more suited to, I don't know, gardening or something gentle like that. The people around her laughed, a sharp, cutting sound. Sarah's hand stilled in her pocket. She turned her head just enough to meet the woman's eyes. Gardening's honest work, she said, her voice low, steady. The woman blinked, thrown off, and turned away, muttering to her friend. The siren blared louder now, the F-22's spiral tightening. The commanding officer, a broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut, stormed out of the control tower, his face red. Is there anyone here skilled enough to fly a Raptor? He shouted, his voice booming over the chaos. The crowd went quiet, heads turning, eyes scanning. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Sarah's gaze shifted, her eyes narrowing. The softness was gone, replaced by something hard, like steel catching the light. She stepped over the barrier, her sneakers hitting the asphalt with purpose. The crowd parted, confused, watching this plain-looking woman walk toward the control room like she owned it. A news reporter, her hair sprayed stiff and her microphone clutched tight, spotted Sarah moving through the crowd. She nudged her cameraman, her voice sharp with excitement. Get this, some nobody thinks she's gonna play hero. Zoom in on her. The camera swung toward Sarah, the lens catching her plain hoodie and steady stride. The reporter leaned into her mic, her tone mocking. Looks like we've got a wannabe pilot here, folks. Probably doesn't even know the cockpit from the cargo hold. The crowd around her tittered, phones raised to record. Sarah didn't break stride, but her fingers brushed the keychain. Again, her lips tightening for a split second before she pushed open the control room door. The young guys by the barrier burst out laughing. The tall one cupped his hands around his mouth. What, you gonna save the day, yoga lady? His buddy with the gold chain doubled over, wheezing. She's gonna crash that jet worse than it already is. Sarah didn't look back. Her steps were steady, her hands loose at her sides. The retired pilot watched her go, his beer halfway to his mouth, frozen. Something about the way she moved, calm, deliberate, made him pause. He leaned forward, squinting like he was trying to pull a memory from the fog. Inside the control room, the air was thick with tension. Officers scrambled, radios crackling, screens flashing red. A major, his uniform crisp and his ego crisper, spun around as Sarah walked in. He looked at her, his lip curling. Don't tell me she's volunteering. She's past her time. Look at her. She's been out of the game for years. A younger officer, wiry and ambitious, chimed in, his voice sharp. 12 years away from the stick. She can't fly a paper plane, let alone a Raptor. Murmurs spread through the room, heads shaking. Don't add chaos, someone said. Let the real experts handle it. A tech at a nearby console, his glasses fogged with sweat, glanced up as Sarah passed. He whispered to his colleague, loud enough for her to hear. Bet she's just here for attention. Probably saw it on TV and thought she'd be famous. His colleague smirked, tapping his screen. Yeah, she's gonna get someone killed. Sarah's hand paused on the door frame, her knuckles whitening for a moment. Then she let go, her face calm, and kept moving. The techs exchanged a look, their smirks fading as she didn't even glance their way, her focus locked on the commander's desk. Sarah didn't stop. She walked straight to the desk, her hand reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a small, worn leather case and flipped it open. The Top Gun instructor badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its edges scuffed, but the name clear. Sarah Mitchell. The room went dead silent. The commander, a grizzled man with gray streaking his temples, stared at the badge, then at her. His voice dropped low, almost a whisper. God, you're Mitchell, the one who downed 7 targets in training. Sarah met his eyes, her face unreadable. There's no time, she said. Open the hangar. The major opened his mouth, then shut it. The younger officer stepped back, his smirk gone. Slowly, reluctantly, they moved aside. The hangar was a cavern of steel and noise, techs rushing, tools clattering. Sarah strode toward the backup F-22, her sneakers echoing on the concrete. A technician, a wiry guy with grease on his hands, looked up from the jet's panel. He snorted, shaking his head. This jet's next gen. She won't keep up. No way. Another tech, older with a permanent scowl, muttered, 12 years gone, her reflexes are fossilized. A young soldier, barely out of training, stood by the cockpit, his face hard. If she fails, that kid dies with her. The words hung heavy, the crowd outside pressing closer, their eyes like knives. Sarah climbed into the cockpit, her movements smooth, practiced. She strapped in, her hands steady, and looked up at the sky through the canopy. Her grip tightened on the stick. An older woman, a base employee with a lanyard swinging from her neck, stood at the edge of the hangar, her arms crossed. She'd been at the base for decades, seen pilots come and go. She leaned toward a coworker, her voice sharp. That's her, the one they're letting fly. She looks like she'd faint at a paper cut. The coworker, a young man with a buzz cut, laughed nervously, glancing at Sarah as she adjusted her helmet. Yeah, this is a mistake. She's gonna choke under pressure. Sarah's fingers paused on the straps, her eyes flicking toward them for a split second. She said nothing, just pulled the straps tighter, her jaw set. The radio crackled, the young pilot's voice breaking through, high and panicked. I can't hold it! It's going down! Sarah flipped switches, the HUD flaring to life. Her voice came through the radio, calm, clear. Listen to me. Follow every move. I'll get you home. The young pilot's breathing hitched, but he managed a shaky, yes, ma'am. Outside, the crowd was a mix of fear and doubt. A ground officer, his face flushed, shouted into his headset, Too late, they'll both explode. Another voice, shrill with panic, cut in. She'll die just like him. Some people turned away, hands over their mouths, unable to watch. Sarah's jaw tightened. She muttered, low enough that only she could hear, I lost 12 years. I won't lose another soul. A teenage boy, part of a school group touring the base, stood on the sidelines, his phone raised to record. He nudged his friend, his voice loud and smug. Check it out. Some lady thinks she's Tom Cruise. This is gonna be a disaster. His friend laughed, zooming in on Sarah's jet as it taxied. Yeah, she's about to make a fool of herself. Bet it's trending by tonight. The boy's teacher, a tired-looking woman, overheard and frowned but didn't correct them. Sarah's jet rolled past, the roar of the engines drowning out their words. Her hand rested on the throttle, steady, unmoved by the noise around her. The F-22 roared to life, the engine screaming as Sarah taxied to the runway. The crowd held its breath, the jet's sleek frame gleaming under the sun. She launched, the force pinning her back, but her hands were steady, her eyes locked on the spiraling jet above. The crippled F-22 was a mess. Fire spitting from its wing, smoke trailing like a wound. Sarah's jet closed in, her voice steady over the radio. "Match my climb. Stay with me." The young pilot's jet wobbled, but he followed, his breathing ragged. Sarah's hands moved like they had never left the controls, every motion precise, every adjustment flawless. She flew wing to wing, a deadly shadow maneuver, guiding the crippled jet back into a stable orbit. A security guard stationed near the runway leaned against a barrier, his radio crackling with updates. He shook his head, speaking to another guard. "She's got no business up there. 12 years out, she's rusty as hell." The other guard nodded, chewing gum. "Yeah, and if she screws this up, it's on her. That kid's done for." Their words carried to the crowd nearby, who shifted uneasily, some nodding in agreement. Sarah's jet climbed higher, her silhouette a dark speck against the smoke. Her hands didn't shake. Her focus didn't waver. The guards' radios went silent, their faces tightening as they watched her jet close the gap. The base was chaos below, people shouting, officers barking orders. The major from the control room stood frozen, watching the screens. The younger officer next to him wiped sweat from his brow, muttering, "She's actually doing it." The retired pilot, still clutching his beer, pushed through the crowd, his eyes wide. "That's her," he said to no one in particular. "That's Valkyrie." A woman in the crowd, her face pale, clutched her husband's arm. "Who is she?" she whispered. The retired pilot didn't answer, just stared at the sky, his hands shaking. Sarah's jet was a blur now, the two F-22s locked in a dance no one thought possible. Warning alarms screamed in her cockpit, red lights flashing. The young pilot's voice came through, weaker now. "I can't. It's burning bad." Sarah's voice didn't waver. "You can. You will. Pull left now." He did, his jet lurching but holding. She mirrored him, her jet so close their wings nearly touched. The crowd below was silent, every eye on the sky. The ground officer who'd shouted earlier stood rooted, his headset dangling in his hand. "She's insane," he whispered, but there was no venom in it now, just awe. A medic standing ready with her team near the runway watched the jets with a clenched jaw. She turned to her partner, her voice low. "If she pulls this off, I'll eat my kit. No way she's got the nerve for this." Her partner, a younger woman, nodded, her eyes wide. "She's gonna crash and we'll be cleaning up the mess." The medic's words were sharp, but her hands trembled as she checked her bag, her eyes flicking back to the sky. Sarah's jet banked sharply, the crippled F-22 following, its flames flickering but holding steady. The medic's hands stilled, her breath catching as the jets descended. The crippled F-22 wobbling, flames licking its side. Sarah's voice stayed steady, guiding the young pilot through every move. "Ease back. Let me take the lead." The runway loomed closer, the crowd holding its breath. The backup F-22 touched down first, a perfect landing, skidding to a stop. The crippled jet followed, its landing gear screeching, smoke pouring as it hit the asphalt. Emergency crews sprinted forward, foam spraying, sirens wailing. The crowd erupted, cheers and gasps mixing into a roar. Sarah unstrapped, her breath heavy, and climbed out. Her legs shook as she hit the ground, but she stood tall, her eyes scanning the runway. A base photographer, his camera slung around his neck, had been snapping shots of the chaos. He lowered his lens, shaking his head at a colleague. "She got lucky, no way she's the real deal. Probably just coasted on someone else's plan." His colleague, a younger guy, nodded, scrolling through his photos. "Yeah, bet she's milking this for fame. Watch her post about it later." The photographer raised his camera again, but his hands hesitated as Sarah walked past, her face pale but composed, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The young pilot stumbled out of his jet, his face pale, his flight suit singed. He looked at Sarah, his eyes wide with something like reverence. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. She nodded just once and turned away. The crowd was still cheering, but the voices from earlier, the mocking, the sneers, were gone. The tall guy with the sunglasses stood at the barrier, his grin long faded. His buddy with the gold chain looked at the ground, kicking at a pebble. The woman in the sundress clutched her purse, her face flushed, avoiding Sarah's direction. Local journalist, her notebook scribbled with notes, stood among the crowd, her pen still. She turned to a bystander, her voice skeptical. She's no hero, probably just in the right place at the right time. The bystander, an older man, with a baseball cap, shrugged. Yeah, anyone could have done that with enough luck. Their words carried, but Sarah didn't hear them. She paused by the runway's edge, her hand brushing the keychain in her pocket. She looked at the young pilot, now surrounded by medics, and her shoulders relaxed just a fraction before she kept walking. Sarah staggered, her breath coming in short gasps. She took a step, then another, her knees buckling. The runway blurred, the world tilting. She hit the ground, her hands scraping the asphalt. Medics rushed forward, shouting, but she waved them off, her voice weak. I'm fine. They didn't. Listen, lifting her onto a stretcher, her protests fading as the world went dark. The crowd watched, silent now, their faces a mix of shock and shame. The retired pilot pushed forward, his navy cap clutched in his hands. I knew it, he muttered. I knew it was her. When Sarah opened her eyes, sunlight streamed through a window, the barracks quiet except for the hum of a fan. She lay on a cot, her flight suit gone, replaced with a plain t-shirt and sweats. Her hand brushed the keychain, now resting on a table beside her. She sat up slowly, her body aching, and looked out the window. The runway was empty now, the jets gone, the crowd dispersed. But something felt different. The air was heavier, charged with something she couldn't name. The door opened, and the commander stepped in, his face softer than before. Behind him, the hallway was lined with pilots and Marines, their uniforms crisp, their faces solemn. Sarah stood, her legs unsteady but her back straight. The commander cleared his throat. Captain Mitchell, he said, his voice carrying, you saved that boy's life. You saved that jet. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. You're still one of us. Sarah's breath caught, her hand closing around the keychain. She didn't speak, just nodded, her eyes bright. A young Marine, barely out of training, stood at the front of the formation, his hands shaking as he held his salute. He'd been one of the loudest doubters earlier, his voice carrying over the chow radio about her fossilized reflexes. Now he stepped forward, his voice low but clear. Ma'am, I was wrong. I'm sorry. His eyes met hers, then dropped to the floor. Sarah looked at him, her expression soft but unyielding. She gave a small nod, her hand slipping into her pocket, and turned back to the commander. The Marine stepped back, his face burning, but his salute held firm. The commander stepped aside, and the formation outside snapped to attention. 500 men and women, pilots and ground crew, stood in perfect rows. In unison, they saluted, their hands sharp against their brows. Sarah's throat tightened. She stepped to the door, her sneakers silent on the floor. She looked at them, these strangers who'd mocked her, doubted her, dismissed her. Now they stood for her. The young soldier who'd warned she'd fail was there, his face red, his eyes down. The technician who'd called her reflexes fossilized stood rigid, his salute steady. Sarah didn't smile, didn't wave. She just stood there, her presence enough. The major from the control room was nowhere to be seen. Word spread later he'd been relieved of duty. His career stalled for his reckless judgment. The younger officer, the one who'd sneered about paper planes, faced a formal review, his promotion delayed indefinitely. The woman in the sundress, a local influencer, found her latest sponsorship deal canceled after a video of her mocking. Sarah went viral, her followers turning on her. The tall guy with the sunglasses slipped away, but his buddies didn't let him forget, their group chat buzzing with jabs about his big mouth. The retired pilot, though, stood at the edge of the formation, his cap back on, his eyes proud. He'd been wrong, but he'd own it. Sarah walked out of the barracks, the salute still holding. She didn't look back. Her steps were slow, deliberate, her hand slipping the keychain back into her pocket. The coastal breeze hit her face, carrying the faint roar of a jet taking off in the distance. She paused, her eyes lifting to the sky. For 12 years, she'd hidden, carried the weight of her past in silence. She'd been judged, dismissed, torn down. But today, she'd flown again, and the world had seen her. Nobody needed to say it. The truth was there in the silence of the crowd, in the weight of that salute. Sarah kept walking, her sneakers steady on the asphalt. She wasn't invisible anymore, she never had been. The sky knew her name, and now so did they. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you didn't belong, this one's for you. You stood your ground, even when it hurt. You carried on, even when they laughed. You weren't wrong. You weren't alone. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with Once Upon a Voice through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally, healing.